Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa van Dijk, and in today's video I want to bring you a little bit closer to the fluid pressure model for breakouts, so that you can better understand what may be happening and how you can effectively tackle it. Now you have to imagine the human body as one giant organic machine, and really that is what we are. We are a machine, just in an organic form. We have pumps, filters, circulation, pressure systems, processing systems, and all kinds of mechanisms that constantly work together to keep the whole thing running. And I try to visualize this with a few images I created using AI, so that you can better understand what I mean, how this pressure can build up, and what you can do to lower it. So imagine that what you are looking at right here is the human body as one giant machine. And one of the things this machine depends on is pressure. And in this model, fluid pressure is what matters the most. The body is made up largely of water, and that water is very tightly regulated. It is constantly being moved around, filtered, retained, released, and adjusted depending on what the body needs. And depending on what you eat and drink, you can influence those conditions. So inside this machine, you have different systems that help regulate everything. You have the kidneys, which you can imagine as part of the filtration and fluid regulation system, because they are constantly involved in controlling what stays in the body, what gets removed, and how much fluid the system is holding on to. Then you have the liver, which you can imagine as one of the main processing and cleanup units, because it is constantly processing what comes into the body and helping deal with all of the different materials moving through the system. And when you look at it mechanically, it actually becomes quite easy to visualize. You have fluid circulating through the machine. You have systems that filter and process that fluid. You have regulators constantly trying to keep everything within a certain range. And all of these parts depend on each other. So now imagine what happens when you continuously change the input going into that machine. And obviously our fuel is not gasoline or diesel, but rather the food we eat and the drinks we consume, and that input directly changes what the machine then has to process and regulate. And the biggest thing I want you to pay attention to here is excessive sodium, because sodium has a major influence on how much water the body holds on to. So when you're continuously bringing excessive amounts of sodium into the system, you are also changing the amount of fluid that the body has to manage. And this is where the pressure aspect becomes important. You can imagine that the machine is constantly trying to maintain a certain internal balance. And then you continuously give it an input that causes it to hold on to more fluid. So now all of those systems have to keep compensating for that changed fluid load. And if that becomes a normal way of eating, then the machine is dealing with those same conditions again and again, rather than getting the chance to settle back down. This is also where the pores come into the picture, because the skin is part of that same organic machine. And the pores can be thought of as little points on the outside of the system that can be influenced by what is happening internally. So if the whole system is dealing with altered fluid pressure, and the material reaching the skin is also being affected by the input going into the body, then those release points can start behaving differently as well. And that is where in this model you can start seeing bumps and breakouts appearing on the skin. Now the tricky thing is that a lot of the excessive sodium is hidden in foods that have already been heavily changed from their original form. They have been engineered and manipulated by humans, whereas whole foods already come with their own natural composition and balance. So once you start taking that original food apart, concentrating certain things, adding large amounts of sodium, adding sauces, flavorings, preservatives, and combining ingredients in ways that are completely different from the original food, you are also changing the fuel that is going into the machine. And if you keep doing that consistently, you can change the conditions the machine has to operate under. So now imagine that this is happening every day. You are giving the machine this heavily manipulated input. The fluid regulation system is constantly having to compensate for it. And then on top of that, you can add other things that intensify the whole situation even further. And I think coffee is a good example here. You can imagine caffeine almost like putting a nitrous oxide injection into the racing car. You get that sudden boost, the system speeds up, you feel more awake and stimulated, and the whole machine is being pushed harder. And if the system is already dealing with a higher fluid load and constantly trying to regulate the pressure created by everything else you're putting into it, that additional stimulation can potentially amplify the problem even further. So it is almost like you already have a machine that is running under strain, and then you give it an extra boost on top of that. And then you could add an additional layer here with stress. Stress creates another form of pressure on the body. So now imagine that the machine has already been receiving the wrong input. It is already compensating for the altered fluid conditions. Then you add the equivalent of a nitrous injection with caffeine. And on top of that, you are driving the machine constantly at maximum capacity because you're stressed. At some point, the whole system is simply being pushed harder and harder from multiple directions. And the pressure has to be dealt with somehow. So when you understand the body this way, you start looking at breakouts as part of a much larger system. You start looking at what you're putting into the machine, how much fluid the body is holding on to, how much of the filtration and regulation systems constantly have to deal with, or what other things may be adding even more pressure on top of that. And then you can start changing those conditions consistently over time. You go back predominantly to unmanipulated whole foods. You reduce the excessive sodium coming from heavily manipulated foods, sauces, convenience foods, and other products where it can accumulate very quickly. And you give the entire system time to settle back into a calmer state. Because this is something that has to happen consistently. If you've been creating the same internal conditions every day for months or even years, then changing your food for a few days is not really going to tell you much about it. You have to change the baseline and give the machine enough time to respond to that change in input. And if caffeine or stress are adding even more pressure on top of everything else, then those are things you can look at as well. So the basic idea behind the fluid pressure model is that we are this incredibly complex organic machine. And the conditions inside that machine are constantly being influenced by what we put into it and by the pressure we create around it. And once you start lowering that pressure and giving the system a more suitable input consistently over time, you are giving the whole machine a better chance to regulate itself properly again. And that is essentially the fluid pressure model for breakouts. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!